Welcome, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. I am excited to talk to you about keys to effective selection. First, a few words about me before I get started. My training and background is as a psychologist. I came to Haas in 2010, and since then have been teaching the core leading people class that I teach at the beginning of the fall semester to the first year students. Probably my favorite class session is on human resource decisions and personnel selection. It draws heavily from what I thought I wanted to study when I got to graduate school. I thought I wanted to study how companies do selection, what methods are effective, and which ones aren't. And as it turned out, that was a lousy research topic because the answers are already so well known. The interesting part of the lessons that come out of the research, these things have been studied to death, is that those insights have not made their way into standard practice for so many companies. And so it makes a great teaching topic. And that is what I want to talk to you about today. I'll be sharing some results that come from my MBA class. If you took my class, it is possible that your results are in some of the data I want to present. I'm going to talk about using interviews to predict performance a great deal, in part because interviews are so common. Quick poll. I would love to ask you to tell me whether your company uses interviews to select people. So you see a poll, I think on the right-hand side of your screen. Does your company use interviews to select people? Go ahead and indicate your answer there if you would. We will talk about different methods of selection, their accuracy and their uses, and then use that to try to think in a sophisticated way about the value of selection. I'll say something about the limitations of different tools for selecting people, and then about how to make the most of the tools we have at our disposal. In particular, how to improve interviews. Let me share the results of the poll so far. So 94% of those of you responding indicate that your company uses interviews. Just about every organization uses interviews to try to select people. So it's worth understanding the strengths and weaknesses of the interview for selecting people. Let's see. End that poll and go back to talking about different forms of selection. If there's one lesson that you'll take from today, and what I want to talk about, it is a depressing one, and that is that selection is hard to do well. The tools that we use to predict performance, none of them predict performance perfectly. I will argue that understanding what skills make someone successful in a job that you're hiring for is essential. It seems obvious, but it is more complicated than most organizations appreciate. Figuring out how to assess those skills, how to assess them in an interview, is essential to making the interview work. Okay, for thinking about different tools, it's useful to think first about how to measure the association between a selection tool and subsequent job performance. Just to clarify, this I hope is pretty obvious, but employee selection involves not just hiring, but also figuring out who to promote and who to place in which jobs. That task is fundamentally a forecasting task where you're trying to predict how someone will perform in the job given your prediction based on some selection tool. And in the chart that you have in front of you, I've put interview performance along the x-axis and work performance along the y-axis, just because that is so common a tool. But I'm going to be talking about relationships between a predictor and an outcome. More generally, the picture you have on your screen now is of perfect prediction. You take a set of people and measure them. How tall are they one day? How tall are they the next day? That should show a correlation of 1, a perfect correlation. that you can predict perfectly how tall someone is going to be tomorrow based on how tall they are today. It is rare to find such a strong, perfect relationship between any social predictor or aspect of a person and something else that you care about down the road. What you have in front of you now is a correlation of 0.9. Height and arm span show a correlation of 0.9 because someone's arms are is highly correlated with how tall they are. That is a very, very strong correlation. Slightly weaker, a correlation of 0.8 that you're looking at now. SAT scores plus high school GPA predicting freshman grades in college. That shows a correlation of about 0.8. A correlation of about 0.7, that's on your screen. Working memory and intelligence show a correlation of approximately 0.7. If you measure someone's intelligence one day and their intelligence a month later, that is a highly reliable measure. That correlation is like 0.7, 0.8. A correlation of 0.6, that's what it looks like. Intelligence and years of schooling is correlated at about 0.6. Parents' heights and children's heights. So if you take a parent's height as the average of mom and dad and use that to try to predict their children's heights, where you get plus 2 inches if you're a boy, minus 2 inches if you're a girl, that correlates at about 0.5. You got a 0.5 correlation on the screen in front of you. The correlation between an individual's height and their weight correlate about 0.4. That's what a 0.4 correlation looks like on your screens. Correlation of 0.3. In any decent sample size, a correlation of 0.3 will be statistically significant. There's a real correlation. You can measure the correlation between how conscientious someone is on a personality measure and their probability of showing up to appointments on time, or how clean their room is. You get a correlation of 0.3. Parents' perceptions of their teenager's mood and their teenager's reports of their actual mood correlate about 0.3. That's the scattergram you're looking at in front of you now. So in thinking about how different selection tools work, it's useful to understand how well the predictor, like an interview, correlates with subsequent job performance. So some of you will have had an inside line to answering this question, but if you had to guess about the correlation between an interview and job performance, what would it be? There's a poll up on your screen. Give it a shot. I am going to be talking about the answer to that question in the context of a set of selection tools, of which the employment interview is just one. So the unstructured face-to-face job interview is the most common selection tool. That's what I'm asking you to predict here. But companies use lots of other tools, including peer rating, job tryouts, integrity tests, biodata, reference checks, job experience. Down at the bottom of that list, graphology, that's handwriting analysis. Not used so commonly in the United States, used with some frequency in Israel and France and some other countries. Age, sometimes people assume that age correlates to some extent with job performance. Looking at the poll results, let me share with you what people have guessed so far. The mode, it looks like we have guesses around the middle of the scale. 0.4 to 0.6 for the predictive validity of the job interview, the unstructured face-to-face job interview. In fact, Schmidt and Hunter's classic review of the literature, which includes hundreds and hundreds of studies, suggests that the correlation between employment interviews and subsequent work performance is about 0.38. That leaves the vast majority of the variance in job performance unaccounted for. If you're using employment interviews to select your people, you should expect to make mistakes. Truth is, no method is perfect. What you see on the chart in front of you includes the fact that the very best predictor, work sample tests, having someone do the job in one period and then the same job again in the next period, only correlates 0.54. That remarkable result leads to a distressing conclusion, and that is that there are big aspects of performance, on-the-job performance, that are fundamentally unpredictable. You're never going to predict with perfect accuracy, 100%, who's going to be great and who's going to be a dud. You will always have false positives, people who you hire who aren't great, and you will always have false negatives, people who you reject who would have been great. That's part of the game. And understanding the relationships between predictors and subsequent job performance highlights that depressing lesson. Closer inspection of this list highlights a few other interesting results. One is that structuring employment interviews substantially increases their validity. It brings the employment interview within striking distance of work sample tests. That is amazing. What does it mean to structure the interview? Talk more about that later. I will say lots of critical things about the interview today. I do not delude myself into thinking that I'm going to persuade you to stop using the interview and replace it with, for instance, GMA tests, which are fairer, cheaper, and better by many measures. Your company is still going to use interviews. I will implore you to structure them because it will increase the validity, it'll increase the predictive power of those interviews for selecting employees in the future. What is GMA? GMA is general mental ability. How do you measure it? Give your applicants an IQ test. Yeah, you can argue that intelligence is more relevant to some jobs than others. If you're looking for blood donors, maybe giving them an IQ test isn't extremely relevant. The truth is, for most jobs that you're hiring for, whether it is senior executive or janitor, more intelligent people will perform better at the job. The numbers on the chart in front of you come from a large variety of different jobs across a wide variety of different industries. Do they apply the same way everywhere? No. But the data are clear that GMA tests are a pretty good predictor of subsequent job performance. They are cheap to administer. You can send someone a link to an online IQ test. Beware, not all online IQ tests are created equal. Some are more valid than others. But it is certainly simpler and cheaper than flying someone to your location, paying your employees to take lots of time interviewing them, pay for hotels and meals and stuff like that. Now, I realize that there are other reasons why you might actually want to meet a candidate. But using it to predict job performance can be done better with a GMA test. Okay. Attempting to deliver this lesson in class faces a profound limitation I've discovered teaching this over the years, and that is that my students, even when they're persuaded by the strength of the accumulated research evidence, are prone to thinking, yeah, most people aren't very good interviewers. I know that that's true. But I am a good judge of character, and I've got the magic. I can predict who's going to be good. So in an attempt to make this lesson personal, I've included the following exercise in my core class. Students have to interview each other in order to predict performance. I needed some consequential performance, some high-stakes performance that mattered. The one that I use is the midterm exam. So ahead of the midterm exam, everyone in the class has to interview 2 other members of the class in order to try to predict their midterm exam performance. Why 2? Well, if you just get 1 prediction, then people who don't do very well predicting that one person's percentile rank in the class can object, well, of course I couldn't figure out how they would perform relative to everyone in the class. I didn't interview everyone in the class. I just interviewed this one person. Okay, so get 2 interviews from each person in the class, and then we can ask questions about whether they get the order right between those 2 people. But recently, in 1 year across a couple sections, with each person interviewing 2 other people, I wound up with 276 interview pairs. Each interviewer, following the interview, they get to structure their interview any way they want. Following the interview, they have to predict how the candidates that they interviewed would perform on the midterm exam. The interviewer scored better, points that count a little bit toward their grade in the class. The interviewer scored better when they accurately predicted how those that they interviewed would perform on the midterm exam. Those being interviewed, I attempted to give them realistic incentives. They got better points on the exercise when the person who interviewed them thought they were going to perform well on the midterm exam, right? Interviewees always have the incentive to impress the interviewer and make them seem as capable and smart as they can. I asked a few questions of the interviewees, things like their GMAT score, and some other things about them. And then I also asked the interviewers to rate the interviewees, the people that they interviewed, on a number of dimensions. What does the distribution of predictions look like? These are the results from just binning the percentile rank forecast made by the interviewers. The blue bars represent the distribution of predictions. The fact that there is no blue bar in the bottom 10% suggests no interviewers thought the person that they interviewed was going to score in the bottom 10% of midterm exam takers. The red bars, of course, indicate reality. That if you just break up the exam performances, you will get 10% in each decile. That follows statistically. The blue bars are skewed high. The mean is 67.8 on a percentile scale, right? So the true average of all percentile ranks must be 50. On average, interviewers were biased up, so they thought that the person they interviewed would do better than they actually did. That might be a direct consequence of the fact that the interviewees had incentives to impress the interviewer, and it worked. Now, interviewers understood these incentives very well because they, in addition to interviewing 2 people, were being interviewed by 2 people. So they ought to have taken their interviewees' confident forecasts of excellent performance in the midterm exam with a grain of salt. And again, they had incentives for accurate prediction. They didn't quite discount as much as they should have, as this graph implies. And it's noteworthy that they're not maximally biased. So they're skeptical. Less than 10% of interviewees were expected to score in the top 10% of all exam takers. What you're probably wondering about is the correlation between predicted midterm exam performance and actual exam performance. That's on this chart. So along the X is the predicted percentile from the interviewer. The Y is the actual percentile rank. And again, the thinness on the bottom end of the scale reflects the fact that few interviewers thought that the people they were interviewing would score among the worst in the class. There is a positive correlation, thank goodness. What we see is a correlation that is not very impressive, 0.11. It is worse than the numbers that emerge from Schmidt and Hunter's meta-analysis. That's sort of interesting, given the highly controlled nature, the clear performance measures in my class. Schmidt and Hunter, the prototypical performance measure that they use is supervisor ratings, right? When you've got performance across a wide variety of different jobs in lots of different industries, what are you going to use as a standard measure of performance? Supervisor ratings. You might worry a little bit that there are some common biases that might affect both assessment of interview performance and supervisor ratings. such as the ability to ingratiate yourself or manipulate someone else. That would lead to shared variance. So highly manipulative people or maybe highly attractive people might be rated positively by their supervisors and do well in the interview. That's probably not such a big factor on my midterm exam. I prefer to think that my midterm exams aren't biased in favor of the pretty ones. It's possible that that accounts for the low correlation in my class. The absolute average error was 29 percentiles. Interviewers could have improved their quality of their prediction on average if they had just guessed that everybody who they interviewed would score in the 50th percentile. That's remarkable because they worked hard. Some of these interviews were long. Some of the interviewers made up what they thought were like simple midterm exams. They gave their interviewees midterm exams, had them sit down and try to answer the questions. They put a lot of work into this. On average, they could have done better had they not bothered with the interview at all and just predicted that the person who they were interviewing would have scored at the median. I mentioned before that each interviewer interviewed 2 people. We can ask whether they got that order right. So how often was it the case that they correctly identified the one who would score better of the 2 people that they interviewed? If they were just guessing randomly, of course, they should get half of them right. How many did they get right? 51%. The scatter plot in front of you has on the x-axis predicted score disparity between those interviewed, and on the y-axis actual score disparity. Again, if the interviewers had been perfect at identifying the disparity in performances between the 2 people they interviewed, this should be a perfect correlation of 1. It's a positive correlation, but it's not particularly impressive. Having identified these imperfections in people's ability to predict others' performances based on an interview, you might be wondering if this is the interviewees successfully duping those who interviewed them. One way to answer that question, and one that gets at the fundamental unpredictability of job performance, is to ask, what do people believe about their own performance on the midterm exam? I asked students in my class to predict how they were going to perform. Like their predictions of others, we see that their predictions for themselves are biased upward. So the mean percentile ranking was 72, a little bit higher than their predictions of others. Again, no one thinks they're going to fall in the bottom decile. And interestingly, less than 10% believe they're going to fall in the top decile. They are biased upward. What is the correlation between people's predictions for their midterm exam performance and their actual midterm exam performance? A stunning 0.04. People don't know how they're going to perform in the midterm exam. Maybe that's because my exam format is new, unfamiliar. It's a multiple choice exam. The people who show up in my class have taken a lot of exams in their life. It's possible they've forgotten about how those exams work. It's been a while. Again, I'm getting people right at the beginning of their first years. And no doubt there are features of my exam and my class that are novel and that bring down this correlation between forecast and actual. Yes. It is also the case that for every job that you haven't done yet, even for jobs that you have, there are aspects of performance in the future that are unfamiliar to you, that you haven't done yet, people that you haven't worked with, project assignments that you haven't had before, economic conditions you haven't faced before. And those novel features of the task or the work will drive down people's ability to predict how they will actually perform at the job. How confident are people in their ability to predict? Well, on average, confidence exceeds accuracy. Here, the scattergram in front of you has self-reported confidence in one's prediction of the interviewees on the x-axis and actual prediction accuracy on the y. This is a modest negative correlation. I don't want to make too much of its negative sign. I will just note that there are many domains in life in which confidence and accuracy are very weakly correlated. Predicting others is one. Eyewitness testimony, interestingly, is another one. Confident eyewitnesses are not more accurate in reporting what actually happened or identifying the culprit. I asked participants how confident they were that their forecast would fall within 5 percentile ranks of the interviewee's actual score. Here I've broken those responses into zones, identified along the left-hand side of the chart you've got in front of you. Averaging the confidence reported in the 90 to 100% zone gives you an average confidence of 94%. There are 18 such predictions. They were right only 11% of the time. On average, across all the zones, confidence is 48%. Hit rate is 11%. Most of us have a great deal of faith in our ability to assess others, to judge others' characters, to predict how others will perform. Testing those beliefs suggests we aren't as good as we think we are. Let me just note here that few companies ever collect the data that would allow them to test whether their interviews or selection methods are effective at predicting performance. Because doing so means interviewing a bunch of people, ignoring those interview performances, and then hiring at random, for instance. Most companies don't have the courage to conduct that study, with good reason. What does predict performance on the midterm exam? What you have in front of you is the results of a regression analysis where I plug in predictors listed along the left-hand side and use them to try to predict exam score. That's model 1, the third column over. The first 6 variables there are, to make that 5 variables, come from the candidate themselves, the interviewee. They told me their GMAT score, their gender, their height, their age, and they responded to the life orientation questionnaire, which is a measure of optimism. The only one that emerges there as statistically significant is the GMAT score. People who with higher GMAT scores did better on my midterm exam. The 3 ratings from the interviewer, likability, attractiveness, and overall assessment of the interview performance, were not useful predictors of actual exam performance. Model 2 is a different analysis. That asks what predicts the interviewer's forecast for how the candidate is going to perform on the midterm exam. There, what should be quite striking is that GMAT score is not a significant predictor, but that rated interview performance is. Okay, so what's the GMAT measuring? I think the validity of the GMAT in this context shares something important with Schmidt and Hunter's assessment of the personnel selection literature. The GMAT attempts to be a measure of general mental ability. GMA tests. Simple, cheap, relatively unbiased. I know they include their biases, but compared to the biases that emerge when you meet someone face-to-face, your automatic responses to their gender, their race, their age, things like sociability, extroversion, talkativeness, similarity to the interviewer, hosts of biases intrude on interview performance that aren't present as dramatically for something like a GMA test. The chart you have in front of you now compares the validity of these things predicting on their own with a combination of that plus GMA. Where there's an increase, it's because GMA is predictive and doesn't share 100% of the variance with that other predictor. So structured interviews plus GMA actually do remarkably well. They get you up to a predictive validity of 0.63. Integrity tests are another fairly cheap assessment tool. They also, like GMA tests, could be administered via an online survey. They're measuring something quite different. They attempt to measure the integrity, the moral righteousness or upstanding nature of the candidate. The integrity tests are imperfect, but the data make them look remarkably good. They do, with GMA, they do even better than work sample tests. Not these differences at the top of the scale are trivial. As you get down to the bottom, handwriting analysis, my guess is we can agree, is mostly worthless for predicting job performance. Whatever validity it gets in combination with GMA just comes from GMA. So how can we use these correlations to figure out how much we should invest in selection, or how we should invest in selection? I'd like to quickly share with you the value of an equation which I talk about a fair amount in class that can quantify in utility per hire per year the value of your selection tool or the value of improving your selection, say by adding GMA to the selection process. First, you need to know the correlation, RxY, between the predictor and the outcome. If you're going to move from unstructured face-to-face job interviews to that plus GMA, what you get is the delta from 0.38 to 0.55. That difference, 0.17, constitutes the change in RxY, the change in the correlation. SDY is a measure of the variability among applicants. Obviously, if there's no variation in applicants and their ability to do the job, it's not going to pay to do any selection. If that variability is huge, then getting a little bit better at selection pays. An estimate on this is tough. You can sometimes get estimates of it based on looking at performance, the disparities in performance among those hired. That's also tough to get. Schmidt and Hunter provide a rough estimate of 40% of the value of the average employee. Again, this will vary a lot by job and by condition. If you can get data specific to your job and your company, you'll make better estimates. ZX is all about the selection ratio. It is the average score on the test, interviews, GMA scores, whatever, of those hired in Z-score form as compared to the general applicant pool. And it's a pretty simple formula, which we will share with you in the link that goes out, along with the survey asking you to rate this presentation. I'll send out a link to the document that allows you to calculate that. It's pretty basic. I argued that if you're going to use interviews, you should structure them because it increases their predictive validity so much. What does it mean to structure interviews? Well, first, use work-relevant questions. They ought to tap the key predictors of success. Doing this well means you have to understand your job well enough to understand what makes someone successful in that job. It's not easy to do rigorously and systematically, collecting data on everybody hired into the job and then seeing what actually predicts performance on that job later. A shortcut to that is to have people familiar with the job and those looking to promote from that job think about what in their experience contributes to success. Thinking hard and rigorously about that and then thinking about how to assess that. Often not so easy. But what you want to do is think about what questions to ask that would tap that, and then how to assess answers. Are there good answers and bad answers? If the question doesn't discriminate between people who you want to hire and people you don't want to hire, don't bother asking the question. It's not a useful question to include in the interview. The same interviewer should ask each candidate the same questions. And this aspect of structured interviews will highlight for you why it is so rare for companies to structure interviews. It makes them boring. If each interviewer has to ask the candidate the same questions in the same order, It takes some of the dynamic spontaneity out of the interaction. That is exactly the point. When you put each candidate in a different position by asking them different questions, subjecting them to a different social situation, different challenges, different opportunities to shine, you don't have a systematic assessment tool. Asking everybody the same question helps reduce some of that variability between interviews that undermines their predictive validity. Again, in the interest of having each candidate face the same situation, have the same interviewers meet all the candidates. Companies often face challenges trying to logistically make this happen, have the same set of interviewers be present for all the candidates. Have a systematic rating system. This could be as simple as each interviewer assigns a score to the responses for each question, and then each interviewer averages across all those scores for each candidate. You want to combine the interviewers' rating systematically. The simple version of this is you just average across all the interviewers. Parenthetical note here, don't bother getting everybody together for a meeting where you discuss the candidates. That too often winds up with the hippo, the highest paid person in the room, exerting undue influence over the decision. Just average across all the interviewers. Your ability to predict performance will be at least as good as if you get everybody together in the room to discuss. And then you might want to combine interview performance together with other tools like a GMA test to predict how people will perform, to help you figure out who to hire. So if interviews are so bad, many of you are thinking, why do so many companies keep using them? I'm glad you asked. First of all, as I already noted, firms most often never bother to collect the data to test the validity of interviews. Second, we all want to believe that we're good judges of character, even though we lack the data to test that theory. Interviewing helps concoct a story around a candidate. Applicants like to feel that they have a voice in the process, so many of them want to be interviewed. And we believe deeply in assessing fit. What the heck is fit? I'm not going to say that fit isn't important. It is. But the way that many companies assess fit is indistinguishable from whim or prejudice. Often fit assessments are highly correlated with who's attractive, tall, who matches the stereotype, who's similar to other people at the company. If fit matters, and it probably does, I urge you to figure out how it matters and how to assess it and include it in a structured and systematic way in your selection process. The cartoon panel shows someone who is refreshingly honest about their success. Actually, Lou, I think it was more than my just being in the right place at the right time. I think it was my being the right race, right religion, right sex, right socioeconomic group, having the right accent, the right clothes, and going to the right schools. That's often what fit winds up meaning. So lessons from what I've talked about that I hope you will take away from today. First of all, the candidate assessment, that selection is hard to do well. Understanding what skills make someone successful at the job you're filling is very helpful. Figure out how to assess those skills. And if you're using interviews, as you probably will, for goodness sake, I implore you, structure them. Thanks. And we have a little bit of time left over for questions. Greg Patterson asks, could making stats correlation discussion shorter focus on... Thanks, Greg. GMA, let's see, I answered some of these questions already. Correlation between college test taking and work success. So I highly recommend Laszlo Bock's excellent, honest, and insightful book, Work Rules. Laszlo Bock is the director of HR, director of people, the people department at Google, and he writes very candidly in his book about Google's struggles with better selection and what they've learned in the process. For a long time, Google was asking all applicants to provide test scores and college grades. They did find that they were predictive of performance, but only in the first couple years at Google. And if they're hiring someone who was 10 years out of college, that those grades were not great predictors of their performance at Google. Part of why that is that Google is using plenty of other selection methods that correlate pretty highly with intelligence. They do not, as a rule, give IQ tests to all of their employees, but they do attempt to structure their interviews, assess mental ability, and figure out systematic ways for assessing the key predictors of subsequent success. In the book, he talks in particular about mini cases, where you give someone a problem to solve in the interview just to see their cognitive processes. Google worked pretty hard to try to understand the relationship of performance on these mini cases and subsequent job performance, and came to the conclusion that they're worthless. They do have the benefit that they make the interviewer feel really smart when the candidate says dumb things or screws up in their answers to the question. But Laszlo Bock attempts to communicate the message to Googlers that if they continue to use these dumb interview approaches, like asking mini case problems, that they will be discounted or ignored in subsequent hiring decisions. That doesn't mean that everyone stops using them. Recommendations for good GMA online tests. My favorite GMA test is purely visual pattern recognition test. Raven's progressive matrices, it is called. It is the company that writes the test charges for its use, but Raven's progressive matrices is a valid and reliable measure of intelligence that does not rely on language. So it's useful cross-culturally and for people whose English skills or cultural familiarity might not be the same. So Raven's progressive matrices is my favorite. Thoughts on whether skills or attitude are more predictive of success? The evidence I know suggests they're both important. My presentation today might leave you thinking that skills are more predictive of success. The reason why you might have that impression is because I've been talking about selection tools, and attitude is hard to measure accurately in a way that the candidate can't fake. So it's too easy for people to figure out what the interviewer wants to hear and to give answers that are consistent with it. What you want is a hard to fake measure that accurately discriminates between those who will succeed at the job and those who won't, that accurately discriminates between those who have the skills and those who don't, accurately discriminates between those who have the right attitude and those who don't. How do you assess someone's attitude? That's really tough. The most valid measures are also those that the candidate can figure out are also used to assess their attitude. And so they can fake. And then what you get is the people who are higher self-monitors, who are more Machiavellian and manipulative, who are more extroverted and attuned to social situations, which for some jobs you could imagine might be predictive of subsequent success, but is not true for all jobs. How long should an interview last? If you're doing the old-fashioned bad type of interviewing, the answer is what you're going to get out of it is pretty shallow and can be observed in the first few moments. So if, for instance, you ask interviewers after the first minute or first few seconds of an interview, how do you think it's going so far, and correlate that with their assessment of the candidate after a half-hour interview, they're so highly correlated that it suggests the conclusion they're not getting any useful information beyond their first impression. Or if they are, they're not updating their first impression. So if that's all you're doing, then the interviews can be short, a couple minutes, and basically you've got what you're going to get. On the other hand, if you're doing structured interviewing the way I've suggested, the questions will vary substantially. Each one is intended to tap some predictive aspect of the candidate, some skill, ability, or trait that you think you can assess. It's going to take time to go through those, so the interview should be as long as it needs to be to assess those things. How many interviews should you have is a closely related question. The answer that Laszlo Bock came to at Google was that after 4 interviews, the additional predictive validity that you got out of a 5th, 6th, 7th, 10th interview, at one point, they would bring applicants to Google for 2 days worth of interviews. That is so costly to your company. Is it worth it? They concluded no. After the 4th one, they weren't getting anything useful. So they don't have Googlers interview with more than 4 people as a rule. Now, would you want each interviewer to ask separate questions? Well, in terms of time and efficiency, yeah. But if you wonder whether you might get additional insight by potentially inconsistent answers to similar questions that different interviewers might answer, acknowledging the noise and imperfection in gathering information on any one of these topics, then you might want to have similar questions appear in multiple interviews, and that might be okay. But the answer to the question is the interview should be as long as it needs to be to assess those things that you really think are valid predictors of subsequent job performance. If that list is short, the interview can be short. What about interview behavior, such as preparation for the interview? Research applicants has done on the company and position and follow-up, emails, thank you letters. Those things can be useful for assessing someone's interest in the position. So I haven't said enough about self-selection. Self-selection is enormously useful. Lots of companies make the mistake of trying to maximize their appeal to the broadest set of possible applicants. That increases your work reviewing piles of applications that come in and might make your selection ratio look bigger. But if the people who you're bringing in, by making it sound like everybody loves working at this company, nobody ever leaves, it's wonderful, it's a great big happy love fest, and we sing Kumbaya together at the end of every workday, there will be a lot of people who get drawn into applying for that job who, once they get there, realize, this is not what I signed up for. The alternative is to attempt to provide realistic job previews that winnows the set of possible applicants, but has the enormous benefit that they're doing the work for you. Self-selection is incredibly beneficial. It is free, first of all, and second, insofar as the individual has any insight in their ability to do the job, the people who self-select in will be those who are more likely to be successful. So providing honest diagnostic information about the quirks of the workplace, what you're expecting of employees, some of the less desirable aspects of the job, will help you with that self-selection process. And increase the ability of the people who you do hire to cope with the challenges that they encounter in the workplace. Every job has its challenges, and realistically knowing what to expect will prepare them better to face those challenges. Do you think structuring interviews in parallel versus interviews in series could be more effective? One interview shares answers highlights of the few others to hear versus 3 or 4 separate conversations. So this is really about whether you do panel interviews or a series of interviews. I think the evidence suggests that the most important aspect here is structuring the interview, and that each has benefits. When you have a panel of interviewers and just one interviewer, one interview session, that has the benefit of being more time efficient for the candidate. Of course, you're using all the interviewer's time, and you get different perspectives on the same response, right? So the candidate says something, and 4 people are listening to the answer. They will interpret it differently instead of having the candidate repeat themselves 4 times, you can capture the variance in interviewers' perceptions all in one sitting. On the other hand, if you're concerned about test-retest reliability of the things that you're measuring, it might be helpful to have the candidate forced to repeat themselves, to test them again on those key dimensions in a variety of different situations. So that's the same question as group interviews versus one-on-one interviews. Adam Grant at Wharton has some good work on assessing attitude. Yep, Adam Grant's a really smart guy who knows the literature well, and he does have some useful ideas on assessing attitude. Notably, there are challenges assessing grit. Optimism by itself is not a great predictor of performance. Angela Duckworth, the researcher most directly responsible for research on grit, has said it's dangerous to try to use grit as a selection tool. What combination of selection tools yields the best validity? I am a big fan of GMA plus something else. If you're going to go based on the research literature, GMA plus integrity tests is awful good, and it's cheap. Practically, I think the most likely combination most companies will go for is GMA plus interviews. And there again, you do much better if you structure your interviews. So that combination is a winner. Realizing that there will always be imperfections suggests the strategy that you do job tryouts, that you bring people in, have them try out the job for a while. Lots of companies, especially companies with quirky cultures like Zappos, have people come in for a probationary period. And Zappos has done something particularly interesting. They pay people to leave at the end of that probationary period. So they have an intense training phase. And anyone who's considering the possibility that this weird workplace is not really right for me, and they would have gained insight into that after having been through the training and attempted to do the job for a little while, you want to get those people out, because you don't want them dragging down performance and dragging down morale among the rest of your promising hires. Zappos' solution is it pays those people to leave. It says at the end of the probationary period, hey, listen, if you're thinking about leaving, we encourage you to do so, and we'll pay you. Well, they were paying $3,000. I think they've upped that now. Maybe it's more like $5,000 or $10,000 to leave. Amazon learned from Zappos and has implemented some of the same practices. They will pay you to leave after a probationary period. You want those people out of the company, and paying them to leave helps you achieve that. What integrity tests do I suggest? There are a variety of them. When you read them, they're quirky. With the survey at the end that you're going to get shortly, I will include a little bit of information on integrity tests to suggest possibilities for ones you might want to use. All of you know how important effective selection is. So I shouldn't have to clarify that selection is among the most important decisions any organization makes. I'm guessing that most of you also care about the fairness and equity of the process. You want to have a selection method that doesn't discriminate on the basis of race, culture, or ethnic background, or gender, or any number of factors that are probably irrelevant to your job. But when you rely for selection on tools where intuition plays such a powerful role, it is somewhere between difficult and impossible for the person making that call to eliminate the biasing influence of their own stereotypes in the process. Some have wondered why Silicon Valley looks so white and male. Why is it that the set of entrepreneurs funded by VCs looks so similar to one another? Well, if what they're doing is pattern matching based on their stereotypes about what makes a successful entrepreneur, they will be biased in who they decide to fund. Reducing the effect of those biases on our judgments depends on using tools that are more valid in predicting performance and that aren't as likely to be tarnished by those sorts of biases. Those of you who've been through my class know already that it's not enough to be a good person or to be well-intentioned. Stereotypes influence our judgments of others in automatic ways that we can't eliminate with good intentions or egalitarian attitudes. When we meet someone, we automatically notice their race, and we can't suppress its influence on our responses to them. Sometimes we can be aware of those responses and act consciously to counteract them. But better is to devise a system for assessment that omits them completely. An instructive story that I tell in my class comes from the London Symphony Orchestra that started to worry that too many of its musicians were white and male, in particular male. They knew there were lots of talented female musicians and worried that their selection process was biased against them. What they introduced was a screen that literally made it impossible for the interviewers, in their case, musical audition, to see the gender of the candidate. So people trying out for the orchestra had to come in and play a piece on their instrument. It used to be that would happen in the presence of the interviewers. What the London Symphony Orchestra did is it erected a physical barrier, a screen that made it impossible for those listening to see who was on the other side of the screen. They realized they also had to force candidates to perform shoeless because the sound of high heels made a different sound than the sound of shoes that the men wore. But once they implemented that change, they got better musicians and better gender representation as well. The London Symphony Orchestra is now well represented. Women are now well represented in the London Symphony Orchestra. A tremendous success story that lots of organizations should seek to emulate, blinding themselves in the selection process to the influence of biasing stereotypes that we don't want to reduce our ability to select the best people for the job. I believe I'm just about out of time and out of questions. Thank you so much for participating today. It's been fun to be with you.